Each year, the world's most powerful and wealthy gather in Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum. While it's touted as a business conference aimed at addressing major global issues like climate change and poverty, who goes and why are they actually there? To answer some of those questions, we sat down with Peter Goodman, global economic correspondent for the New York Times and author of Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
The World Economic Forum just wrapped.
Right.
There's been a lot of news about it, but I think there are actually a lot of people out there who don't necessarily understand what the World Economic Forum is. So maybe we can start off there. What just happened? What's the WEF and what's Davos?
Well, first of all, I should tell you that there are plenty of people who've been to the World Economic Forum multiple times who don't really know what it does either, because it's a bewildering experience that's sort of different experiences depending upon who you are. Basically, it is an annual gathering of the world's most powerful people in an oddly charmless village high up in the Swiss Alps. That's very difficult to get to, very much by design. There are heads of state. There are a lot of billionaires running around. Heads of financial and tech firms. There are always a few celebrities. There are a whole bunch of journalists, and then there are a bunch of very well-intentioned activists, academics. I mean, there's a lot of smart and thoughtful people wandering around there, and they are ostensibly there to attend the World Economic Forum, which is a bunch of earnest panel discussions devoted to all the sorts of subjects that you might expect at such an event. This is the front-facing part of the forum. They attend panel discussions held in a conference center on all of the things that you might expect: climate change, the future of work, automation. There was a lot of conversation around cryptocurrency this year, privacy, national security, and the cool kids, though, the people who actually matter, the CEOs who are paying literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to attend, will tell you with some pride, it's like a badge of honor, that they don't even set foot in the conference center. They don't go to a single one of those panels. They just sit in suites in private doing deals. The founder of the forum, a guy named Klaus Schwab, likes to play matchmaker. You know, this is a chance to seat the head of a North American or European oil company across a table from a member of the Saudi monarchy with no one around, no nuisances like journalists or regulators. They can just meet in private. All of this is wrapped up under the mantra committed to improving the state of the world, which gives away the con, because the people who are gathered in Davos are by any relevant measure the ultimate beneficiaries of the status quo. And the idea that they're there to promote change is not only laughable, it's contrary to the point. They're there to convince us that they're there to promote change through their virtue signaling via their attendance, while they carry on making the world more the way that it already is, which is to say a very friendly place for people who already have billions and are seeking to use those billions to get the next billions.
So how do we solve some of these problems if they're making these decisions on a global scale? What are the answers?
We disabuse ourselves of the notion that these billionaires would have us buy into, that they do have our best interests at heart, and we should understand these do all sorts of miraculous things. Thank you, Jeff Bezos, for Amazon. I'm not sure how we would have gotten through the pandemic without e-commerce. Yes, banking and financial services and technology are useful parts of modern life, and the people who are good at it, we've made, an awful lot of social progress that we want to hang on to. But there are certain aspects of World War II economy that lasted until the 1970s that were just simply better for most people. We had more powerful labor unions. We had real antitrust enforcement instead of this absurd idea that markets left to run to their own device will end up with fewer choices and higher prices. And that's really the world that we're living in. Like climate change, we require democracy. That's the solution to our problems.
So tell me a little bit about your book. What do you take a look at in your book? And because I believe that you have
Sure.
five different billionaires, and maybe you could take us along the journey.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could have written about, I could have written the book using 5 other billionaires or 20 other people. I focused on, yes, 5 billionaires: Jeff Bezos, who we've discussed briefly, Larry Fink, who's the head of BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset management company. At the time I was writing the book, he was in control of $10 trillion in investment. Steve Schwartzman, who's the world's largest private equity magnate, who runs Blackstone. Mark Benioff, who's on the board, and so is Fink for that matter, of the World Economic Forum, and is in some ways my most interesting character. He's the CEO of a Silicon Valley tech company called Salesforce, who 2 years ago, at a virtual gathering of the forum, they couldn't meet in Davos because of the pandemic, literally said the CEOs are the heroes of the pandemic. Not non-governmental organizations, not government. They didn't save you. We saved you, not for profit, but simply to save the world. And, that's this magnificent phrase that, again, gives away the game, because it's about using Davos to signal that you don't have to regulate us, you don't have to tax us, we'll take care of your problems. My fifth character is Jamie Dimon, who's the head of JP Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States, and who played a leading role in delivering the tax cuts that played out under President Trump. $1.5 trillion worth of tax, sold as this idea that we'd see a spur of investment and hiring and all sorts of things that would benefit ordinary people, none of which actually happened. The part of the trickle-down fantasy that invariably does happen is people like Jamie Dimon end up with most of the money, and that's what happened in that case as well.
Well, in this recent conference in Davos, there was a lot of talk about climate change, a lot of talk about mental health. They seem to have gotten rid of the Build Back Better, Great Reset mantra. So what does that mean?
They understand what the concerns of the rest of society are, but that doesn't mean that they're actually willing to do the things that would be required to help the rest of society. I mean, in Davos, the ethos is always win-win solutions, which is, a nice way of saying no one has to sacrifice. And if no one has to sacrifice, then billionaires don't have to do anything except for, sign statements and express their sympathy for the rest of the planet while they continue to rig the system to end up with most of the bounty of a very successful form of capitalism. So, I've been to Davos 10 times, and there's always a nod at what's actually happening. I mean, I remember being there in January of 2017. Trump's about to be inaugurated. Britain, where I was then living, 6 months into Brexit, both of these political upheavals expressed as, a sign that ordinary people have lost faith in the elites, and for good reason, by the way, that there's this backlash to the entrenched way of doing business because ordinary people have seen wage stagnation or outright decline in their pay, rising rates of joblessness, despair, cuts to social services. So people are really angry. And I remember in Davos that year, there were all these panels about, what's going on with populism and how do we deal with this threat to the liberal economic order? And I went around and surveyed the crowd that year, and there was lots of talk from CEOs of companies. Workers have to take responsibility for their own job training. Arianna Huffington, who had just launched a new business focused on wellness and getting sponsorships from spas and skin cream companies, talked about how we all need to sleep more. Ray Dalio, a hedge fund guy who goes to Davos every year, said we need more deregulation to unleash the animal spirits of the market to make the world more conducive for money making, which is a very curious thing to hear from someone who at that point was worth $18 billion. We heard everything except for some of us here in Switzerland are going to have some of what we've got so that more people can benefit from capitalism. And so this year, yes, people are talking about the pandemic, they're talking about climate change, they're talking about mental health and work-life balance and all sorts of things that are very real and that are very meaningful to people. But what comes of it is simply talk, because that's the point of Davos. It is a prophylactic against change. It's an elaborate way of saying, we've got this, look at us talking, therefore, carry on.
I'd like to play this clip of Chrystia Freeland from Canada. She was basically talking about the middle class and her thoughts regarding the middle class. And I'd like to have your thoughts on what she said.
Sure.
I talked to a hedge fund guy, Greenwich-based, originally Scandinavian, went to a liberal arts college, about the hollowing out of the American middle class. And he said, sort of in sorrow, but also as an investment strategy, the low-skilled American worker is the most overpaid worker in the world. Another observation, again, this was from the CEO of a big fund manager, and he said this wasn't his point of view, but a point of view expressed at his investment committee, was that the hollowing out of the American middle class didn't really matter if you could look at it from a global perspective. And this was how he put it. His point was that, and this is his colleague's point, if the transformation of the world economy lifts 4 people in China and India out of poverty and into the middle class, and meanwhile, 1 American drops out of the middle class, that's not such a bad trade. And in some ways it's not, but if you're in that American middle class, it's not so great.
Your thoughts?
It's terrifying. I mean, how could any ordinary person not be terrified to hear that that's the view of their livelihood, their ability, the importance of their ability to feed their families at a decent middle class standard to the people who have most of the money. And Christia is certainly in a position to know what the wealthiest people think, because she was a longtime, very successful journalist at the Financial Times before she went into politics in Canada and became deputy prime minister. She's on the board of trustees, or she was at least the last time I checked, of the World Economic Forum. So she has tremendous access. And she also wrote a book that I would recommend while she was still a journalist called Plutocrats. So she's familiar with the mindset. And, I think it shows this callous disregard for people in our midst. And this tribe that I refer to in my book as Davos Man, and yes, they are mostly men, though there are some women as well, they have no, this is a phrase I stole from Samuel Huntington, the political scientist who coined it in 2004 to refer to people who, attend the forum, but who also have no particular loyalties to any jurisdiction because, any national loyalty, for instance, because they employ, accountants and lobbyists across multiple jurisdictions. Their money could be tucked away in offshore accounts in Britain, in the Caribbean, in Singapore. And so they're really thinking globally in a way that is not helpful. We should be thinking globally about security, about climate change, about social justice, but we have to think locally because that's where our democracies live, about people's needs. And by the way, it's simply a fallacy to suggest that, there's an either or, that, and this is the classic Davos Man thought, right? That we either have the world as we experience it, where we have the miracles of modern medicine, we have COVID vaccines, we have things we love like central air conditioning and great cars and vacation destinations, or we monkey with this formula. And that formula, by the way, includes a lot of economic inequality. And we can try to fix that, but then we might as well, be in Venezuela diving into dumpsters for our dinner. There's no in between. And that's just nonsense. And it's telling that one of the people Christia is telling us about says, well, if somebody escapes poverty and reaches the middle class in China, that's, equivalent to someone leaving the middle class in North America. We can have both. Where's the money going? I mean, the U.S. has been the ultimate beneficiary of globalization, has done extremely well in trade with China. The problem isn't China. It's not that there's a zero sum between people who want to be middle class in China and people who want to be middle class in America. That's a very helpful construction for self-interested politicians who are opportunistic and would like us to demonize people who live very far away instead of people in our midst. The problem is what's happened to the money. And what's happened to the money is that the people who Christie is speaking to, the CEOs of large companies, the billionaire class, have managed to use their wealth to rig our political system, to pervert our democracy so that the laws are working to help them protect and amass their wealth. The problem isn't that we've been fleeced by China. The problem is that we've been fleeced by boardrooms in New York and Seattle and Congress in Washington. trade is a good thing. The problem is how we've distributed the gains. So I find it highly revealing, and I think it's useful that you've played that quote, that's the conception for somebody who doesn't have problems of budgeting and figuring out how to pay for groceries or buy shoes for kids, that, hey, one middle-class person anywhere is all the same. It's not that it's some sort of secret government and corporations and governments are working hand in glove. We should be so lucky that corporations and governments could coordinate that effectively, because if they could, then we could take control through democratic power and actually get them to do things that we want them to do. The forum, the front-facing part of the forum, is a performance. The stuff that actually matters is happening behind closed doors, and it's not a coordinated, global government. It's individual actors with power pursuing their self-interest behind closed doors. Now, have our democracies been taken captive by corporate interests in key ways? Without any question. I mean, the money in politics should disturb us greatly. But this stuff is happening in plain view. I mean, we don't need a conspiracy theory to describe what's happening. We can just go and see what's happened over the last half century with a highly effective, bottom-up, systematic transfer of wealth from everybody to a handful of people, many of whom go to Davos. And they're doing that, through lobbying, through a rewriting of the tax code. I mean, they're doing it right there in offices that we can watch for ourselves. So we don't need some grandiose theory of Davos as some secret society to make all this work. Davos is nothing more than a gathering of highly powerful people, but it's also nothing less, which is to say, what goes on there is what goes on whenever powerful people go and meet. They pursue their interests.
And so what would be your closing thoughts to the audience to read your book, to learn a little bit more about what the World Economic Forum is, or maybe take a closer look at these issues in general?
Yeah, I don't think the forum matters that much. It's a good opportunity to talk about the stuff that actually does matter. And what I think matters most is that if you look at most of our problems in modern life, they amount to a handful of people having most of the resources that we could be using to solve problems that we have the intellectual bandwidth to solve. We have the capacity. We often have the will. What we don't have is the political ability to get our hands on the resources. And so, if you look at the upsurge of anti-immigrant right-wing populism that we've seen in our own country, in England, and the rest of the United Kingdom through Brexit, and in even Sweden, the supposed bastion of social democracy, where an extremist party, I tell the story in my book, that has its roots in the neo-Nazi movement, has risen to be the second most popular party in the country on the strength of demonizing immigrants. We see a similar story in Italy, in France, and on it goes. And usually what's going on is over decades, the powerful people have used their power to vacuum up the money. They've liquidated public infrastructure. They have liquidated investment in healthcare, in education, in housing, in transportation, and they've given the money to themselves through tax cuts. And that leaves large numbers of people legitimately angry and feeling like their needs don't matter to the elites. And that leaves them right for the pickings for political opportunists who then come along and tell, simplified stories. Oh, your problem is, Central American gangs. Your problem is Chinese people stealing your legacy far away. Your problems are right here at home in terms of how we distribute the bounty of our successful form of capitalism. So, if a reader takes one message away from, my conversation with you, my book, it's that what's happening is not by accident. And it doesn't mean it's a conspiracy. It means that we have to get back to using our democracies for ends that actually serve people who live in those democracies instead of a handful of people who manage to influence the course of history.
One last thing I wanted to play for you, because I thought it was Pretty interesting. John Kerry, I don't know if you've seen the clips of him this year, but I think this is perhaps a reason why some people are just angry right now when they see what's coming out of Davos.
Yeah.
I'll just play the audio.
Sure.
Extraordinary that we, select group of human beings, because of whatever touched us at some point in our lives, are able to sit in a room and come together and actually talk about saving the planet. I mean, it's so almost extraterrestrial to think about, quote, saving the planet. And if you said that to most people, they think you're just a crazy tree-hugging, lefty, liberal, do-gooder, whatever, and there's no relationship. But really, that's where we are.
Okay, so your thoughts?
Let's parse that. In Davos, talk is action. So we're supposed to celebrate the fact that all these people are there talking. Well, that's great. What are they going to do when they get back to their countries and are in a position to actually make policy? Presumably more talk. I mean, Benioff, who, like I say, is probably my favorite character in my book, loves to talk about, we need multi-stakeholder dialogues. Everything needs multi-stakeholder dialogues. I mean, at a certain point, people don't just want to be heard. Sometimes people actually want things to happen. And I think Kerry there is reflecting the fact that people in Davos are so steeped in discussing the conversation, like that's the thing that matters, that he's tone deaf to the reality that we actually need change. If we're going to deal with climate change, things need to happen. And those things that need to happen are going to involve a lot of participants at places like the World Economic Forum, giving something up. And by the way, if they do it wisely, we'll all benefit, not just in terms of surviving, but in terms of economic policies. That ironically, this is an area where there are win-wins. If we make some sacrifices in the immediate term, if fossil fuel companies give something up, to pick the obvious example, and we make proper investments in green energy, we could have a much more robust economy and more jobs. And by the way, we could survive, which would be kind of nice. But I do think that this is a perfect example of how talk is the ultimate currency in Davos.
But I also think it was to say we were chosen for some reason at some point in time. We're the arbiters. Right. What should be done with the environment? That irked me.
Yeah, I hear you. I think you're right to underscore that. This idea that the people who are here somehow represent, some kind of meritocracy, like we're the best and the brightest, as opposed to, let's face it, most of us are creatures of privilege. And there are a lot of people not in the room who need to be heard from, and whose opinions and views and needs are every bit as important, and in many cases much more important than the people who go to places like Davos, because they're generally so out of touch.
Peter, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you so much. I hope that our audience gets your book, Davos Man. Terrific read. And where can they get it?
They can get it. Well, they can get it at their independent bookstore, I like to say, or they can get it online wherever they like to buy books. They can get it from Audible if they like audio books. It's on iTunes. It's on Kindle, all those kind of platforms.
Terrific. Well, Peter, again, thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.